Welcome to the COPD Foundation podcast. We bring you insights from leading health professionals, inspiring stories from those living with lung conditions, practical advice, and the latest in lung health research. Be sure to subscribe, follow us on social media, and visit copdfoundation.org. Take action today, breathe better tomorrow. Just a quick note before we jump into our topic. This podcast series was created for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for formal medical advice. Talk to your healthcare provider if you have any questions.
Welcome to this episode of the COPD Foundation podcast. I'm Johnny Karenko, your host, a respiratory therapist, and an educator with the COPD Foundation. Thank you for joining us as we delve into the benefits of pulmonary rehabilitation programs for people who have chronic lung conditions. We have two guests with us today, Christina Hunt, the Senior Director of Bronchiectasis and NTM Education and Care Delivery, and Alyssa Dittner, the Assistant Director of Bronchiectasis and NTM Education and Community. Together, we are going to explore how participating in a pulmonary rehabilitation program can significantly improve the daily lives for those who are living with chronic lung conditions. This episode is part of a two-part series with the other available on our Bronchiectasis and NTM 360 podcast. Let's begin.
Okay, so can each of you guys tell me what drew you into this field of care, particularly for people with chronic lung disease, and essentially why do you love pulmonary rehab?
I was drawn to pulmonary rehab because for a very long time, I spent my career working in acute care, and I really didn't ever get to know my patients. I would be at the bedside, working with ventilators, and I never really could follow their journey, and it bothered me. So when I got the opportunity to work in pulmonary rehab, not only had I always been very interested, I got my bachelor's degree in the science of food, nutrition, and exercise. So I had a good base there of an education on the subject. And I've always been interested in, wellness and things like that. I said, well, this may give me an opportunity to get to know my patients better. And it really did. And not only did it give me a chance to get to know my patients better, but it gave me an opportunity to kind of tailor our therapy and rehab around their specific goals and be able to see them accomplish things that they had set out to do. And I think in the 10 years that I worked in pulmonary rehab, that was the most rewarding experience I've ever had. I almost felt like many of these patients became some of my closest friends. Some of them still, I've been at the foundation 5 years now, and some of them still text me today just to, keep me abreast of what's going on with their kids or their grandkids or where they're going on their next trip. And it was just such a rewarding experience, just fully to be able to get to know my patients, work with them closely, and like I say, see them meet their goals so that they're living, the best quality of life that they can with their lung condition. Alyssa, how about you?
So for me, it was a little different. When I was in respiratory school, they didn't really talk too much about pulmonary rehab. We weren't really educated on it. We didn't have any classes surrounding it. So when I was working at one of the largest hospitals in Wisconsin, I was talking to patients who were going through all sorts of things, all sorts of lung diseases, and just hearing the fact that they were so deconditioned afterwards. So to try to take that a step further, I was looking into other options, and I knew that patients were getting physical rehab. So then I started to really learn about pulmonary rehab. Then I went into a different hospital system, and I became a COPD educator or navigator. Some of you might know this as. But when I became the COPD educator, I had to train in pulmonary rehab. So I really got to see the firsthand experience of what people were going through, to see them start, to see them finish. And I was like, I need to shout this from the top of the roofs because this is doing so much for people. And how can I help people get notified about this and help them realize that this can be life-changing. So I started introducing it into what I was doing at the bedside. Now I developed a pulmonary program at one of the hospitals that I was working at. So trying to reintroduce this conversation into patients' lives. But so I would say my journey with this has been a unique one. I didn't have any training in it. It was just something that I noticed that people would benefit from. In fact, I have a nice little fact to share is for every 1 week a person is in the hospital, we lose about 12 to 40% of muscle. Now that is a number that can differ depending on what a person is in the hospital for, and if they were intubated, if they were on different types of machines, how active they were. But just to know that every time a person is in a hospital, that you are deconditioning, losing muscle, and how can we then expect the person to go home and then be completely normal? So introducing them into pulmonary rehab early and starting that conversation, that's really how I became involved in pulmonary rehab.
Thank you. And so there might be some people who are listening to this who've never heard of pulmonary rehab, have no idea what the components of a typical pulmonary rehab is. Christina, could you explain what someone should expect if they enroll in a pulmonary rehab program?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing everybody thinks about when it comes to pulmonary rehab is exercise, an exercise program for people with lung condition. And I used to term it that, but it really is so much more. It's education. And so, the highly trained healthcare personnel that work in pulmonary rehab, where a lot of times it is respiratory therapists, but it can be physical therapists, it can be RNs. But the folks that work in there really know all about many different lung conditions and how to manage them on a daily basis. So they pride themselves in spending that time, the time that patients don't get with their doctors because the offices are so busy, and the time they get in front of their physician and other clinic personnel is very, very short. So when they get in pulmonary rehab, they have the time to sit down and go through all the ins and outs of how to manage the condition at home and do it better, and including how to take their medicines and including oxygen therapy education and how and when to wear your oxygen. And so that education component is huge when it comes to pulmonary rehab. The other thing is support, and the support comes in multiple different forms. The patients there get it from the team of folks that are working with them, but they also get it from each other, because typically there are other folks working, exercising in the room that have lung conditions, and they support each other, encourage each other, and most importantly can relate. There's no young, typically 21-year-old running full throttle on a treadmill. Everyone there has a lung condition and knows what hard days are like, and then they applaud and those milestones and when goals are met, and then they support each other when it's just a tough day. And a lot of times, related to pulmonary rehab are support group meetings. They're not always affiliated with the pulmonary rehab program, but when the folks that are exercising there get to spend time with each other, they find out they really like it. And oftentimes they'll set up support group meetings or just meetups where they can hang out with each other, talk about concerns, and support each other outside of pulmonary rehab too. So I really feel like it's full circle. It's the exercise, it's the education, and it's the support for sure.
I always like to say that pulmonary rehab is like having your own team of personal little cheerleaders, right? So they're all there
totally.
to cheer you on, and they really look at you like a holistic aspect of it. So when they educate, they're, like you said, they're not only educating on the physical component, but the mental health component, and also talking about food. I mean, food is so important, and what we put in our body can really affect our lungs. So getting that information. There's a ton of information out there about food and nutrition and what fuels the body, or what's even advertised as fueling the body, but really we know that doesn't. So sifting through all of that information and trying to boil it down to what is important to me, I think is something that is super beneficial for people, so they don't have to feel like they're doing it on their own. And you're already dealing with a chronic illness that is sometimes worse. You have bad days and sometimes you have good days, but just to feel that you have those personal cheerleaders there and they've sifted through all the information, I think really speaks a lot to what pulmonary rehab does for people.
I'm hearing a common theme from both of you, that there's a group dynamic and a support network that people, when enrolled in a pulmonary rehab program, have. Do you have any examples of success stories or a way that you've seen that support system help people even after they've completed their pulmonary rehab program?
I just feel like it's the relationship building. I have been at the foundation for the last 5 years, and so I haven't seen many of my former patients in quite a long time, and I still get text messages and updates from them. Some of the success stories that we would all be thrilled about is, are goals that patients have when they come in, and tangible goals they want to reach. I think, another story that sticks out in my mind is a dad who wanted to be able to walk his daughter down the aisle at her wedding that was coming up. And he came in and I can't remember the specific distance, but he came in, and when we were talking in our initial assessment, he knew exactly how many feet it was from the back of the church to where he was going to give her away. And he said, Christina, I need to be able to do this. He said, I'll be fine wearing my oxygen, but I need to be able to walk unassisted from the back of the church to walk my daughter up to the front of the church. And I said, well, we've got some work to do, but we're going to do it. And we trained literally for that moment. The weekend after, well, first I got a text when it was successful, which brought tears to my eyes because it's all I wanted for him. But then also when he came in the following week and saw his other patients in the room that were in his same time slot, they cheered so loudly and were so excited to see him following the wedding. It just really was so heartwarming, and knowing that this was a goal that he set out for himself, knew he wanted to feel his best, and did it and accomplished it. And we were just a small portion of it because, he really said, I want to do this pulmonary rehab. I want to feel my best, and I want to be there for my family. So it was so impactful.
You gave me chills. That is such an awesome story.
Yeah.
I would say my story that comes to mind is, so we had somebody come through pulmonary rehab and he stopped coming at 6 weeks because he was in the hospital. So what happened was he was in the hospital because of COPD. He had restarted smoking after he left the hospital, which I think is a little bit ironic because he was in with shortness of breath and was on a couple of different machines to help him breathe. But I think that it was all just becoming too much. And he just felt like, I am just going to give up. I don't even care. I'm going to do what I like. And the anxiety of everything that's going on. So going back to his room and talking to him after he had this whole experience, he had said he started smoking again. So just talking to him about smoking and being able to convince him to go back into pulmonary rehab, and then other people being there. And then he was starting to ask people about their stories. And then after he asked them and heard, I'm going to help you quit smoking. And someone said, I'm going to help you do this, and we're going to do it together. And he ended up finishing out his full 12 weeks of pulmonary rehab and hadn't touched a cigarette. And I think just being able to, again, have that support system and have that group of people to be there for him was really a really great success story. And unfortunately, I don't know what ended up happening after, he left pulmonary rehab, but I do know that he did build that community. So hopefully he ended up quitting for life and changed things.
And I think, I think there are a lot of sunshine and rainbows with the program, but I think also it's important to mention that there are patients that tend to have some setbacks from time to time. Maybe they have a hospital admission or a flare up, or they catch a virus, and it just catches them off guard. And it can really feel like the weight of the world is on their shoulders when they walk back in there, and they feel like they've lost ground, so to speak. But that support group and that network of folks who are so encouraging and understanding, and more importantly also the providers in there that know how to pick you up by your bootstraps, so to speak, and give you a plan to get you back on your feet and back where you were, is just so empowering to the patients, because we all know that things can happen, and so when they know that they have a whole group of folks that are waiting for them, to get them right back on track, it's really important, and an important aspect of pulmonary rehab, I think.
Absolutely. And any person with a chronic illness might have a flare of that chronic illness,
Right.
So it's amazing that if you're in a pulmonary rehab program with clinicians who can help you maybe take a look at your action plan. Where are you now? What do you do if you're starting to feel these symptoms? Who do you call? Where is your rescue inhaler? Or what do what medications do you take? And as we've kind of already mentioned, the other people in the room who have also had flare-ups, who maybe, as Alyssa mentioned, maybe have also smoked or relapsed in smoking, and they've also experienced that and said, hey, you know what, quitting's hard, and I get it, and let's do this together. This is what worked for me, and it took me 3 tries, or so on and so forth, because there's a lot of shame and blame associated with chronic lung disease, especially if you have a smoking history. And, at the end of the day, these are people who still need to get up and feel good and exercise, and they're still our patients, and who cares if they smoked? Let's get them feeling well. Let's get them the best care that they can. So what would you say to any healthcare providers that might not be referring people to pulmonary rehab because they might not understand the benefits of the program?
So I think referrals to pulmonary rehab need to be thought of sooner. Um, you know, the trend was, and this was 5 years ago, but I can't imagine that it's changed a whole lot. The trend was that the patient would come in to be seen at either their 6-month or annual visit, and the physician would notice a decline and say, in them physically, and they would say, let's send you to pulmonary rehab. And they could have had the diagnosis for years and never have heard about it. Um, and so I think getting the person in, whether they're newly diagnosed or in the middle of their journey, to get them in sooner rather than later, so that it's not a fire alarm. It's not like what can we do? What can we do to get this person stronger? It's more of what tools can we give them so that they can manage
Right.
their condition throughout their life.
Not playing catch up.
Exactly. In case in point, I had, I don't know if you ladies remember the old breath spray, the Banaka, where you would spray it really fast in your mouth. And I'll never forget this gentleman who had had his diagnosis for years. And he, again, comes in for that initial assessment. He's winded by the time he walks across the room. And he sits down in the seat and he goes, hold on for a second, sweetie, I'm going to use my inhaler real quick. And he used it just as fast, probably did 3 puffs in 3 seconds. And I was like, well, that right there tells me we need to start with, medication administration as 101. And when I explained to him how to use an inhaler properly, he said, Christina, I have had COPD for 20 years. And I can't remember when someone told me how to use this inhaler any differently. And he might have been able to manage his symptoms fairly well without using that rescue inhaler up until that point. But, I knew, seeing that he was using it like breath spray, and that medicine wasn't getting where it needed. We had some fine tuning to do, sort of late in his journey. And I thought to myself, how much different or would he feel right now had he had some of these tools 20 years ago, 15 years ago? Would I be seeing him right now, or would he still be living his best life all the while managing his COPD? So that I cannot stress enough to HCPs to think about it. If not just for the exercise, and even if your patient's high level physically, but for the education piece, and for that alone, I think would be an amazing idea to get your patients into pulmonary rehab. Then there wouldn't be this rush to get them in, and they could be seen appropriately, get the tools they need, and be able to manage their condition throughout their life.
And I would add to that a little bit. What I would tell providers is I was privileged enough to have a hospital that had pulmonary linked to it. So we had a pulmonary clinic linked right to the hospital. So this may have been easier, but just to champion a pulmonary navigator role. So to champion having a respiratory therapist go in and being able to educate patients on this. We know that providers' offices are really busy, and sometimes they have 15 minutes or so to spend with a patient. In fact, I think the average time that the appointment lasts is about 17 minutes. And that's with the provider speaking 5.2 minutes and the patient speaking about 5.3 of those minutes. So that's really not that much time to have these conversations and to feel that you are fully getting across all the different points. And I think by having a navigator position, by having a respiratory therapist, and I speak to respiratory therapy specifically because they're trained in the lungs. That is their passion. And when you have a respiratory therapist go in, they can teach about all these different lung diseases and look and evaluate. This is what I think that you would benefit from. And let's try to talk to your doctor about this and let me follow through on this. So I think I would say to providers is to see what else we can do. If you can't have these, or if you're forgetting to have these conversations early, what can we do to introduce these things into a setting where we're seeing patients, which is in the hospital? Many people avoid their symptoms for a long period of time. And in fact, what people usually get diagnosed with COPD in, I would say typically stage 2. So when they're diagnosed later on, and you've already lost all of that in the front end. But if we can start noticing these things happening in the hospital system, if we can start these conversations earlier, we can help to educate people on it and help them coach them of what they should be talking to their providers about.
Absolutely. And another thing is just, research literature wise, we know that, when people are enrolled in pulmonary rehab programs, that they have fewer exacerbations, that they're going to the ER and the hospital less. So from a healthcare provider perspective, if you're enrolling your patient or referring your patient to pulmonary rehab, they will have less symptoms. They will need less, hospital and healthcare provider resources. They will be essentially, hopefully, healthier and less symptomatic. So if someone is listening that has a chronic lung condition, is interested in getting started with pulmonary rehab, what would be your advice for them?
I'd say if you're interested in pulmonary rehab, ask your physician. Tell them that you're interested in pulmonary rehab. Typically, all you need to get started in a rehab program is a physician's order, and they like to have pulmonary function tests, PFTs, done so they can kind of see the extent of how the lungs are affected, and be able to kind of give you some feedback. And it's also an education tool that the folks working in pulmonary rehab will be able to kind of show you and be able to and help you interpret your own PFTs and what's going on with them and things of that nature. So again, all you really need to do is express interest to your provider, ask if you can be referred to pulmonary rehab and have the pulmonary function. There may be some additional testing that each specific rehab center may want, but typically it's fairly easy to get going. There may be a little bit of a wait, but call them and get on the schedule. And if it's not available to you locally, there are also virtual pulmonary rehabs out there that may be able to offer you services that way. And ask your doctor if they have any suggestions if you don't have one close by.
Absolutely. So thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you, Johnny. It was great being here.
Thank you for tuning into the COPD Foundation podcast. And remember, whether you're managing a chronic lung condition, providing support to those who are, or just want to learn more about lung health, the COPD Foundation is here to support you. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and follow us on social media. Take action today, breathe better tomorrow.